I will go live in a minute. Please bear with me. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to our keynote session. I'm Bayas Ahmed, lecturer in risk and disaster science at UCL IRDR. Today, we are truly honored to have Mr. Marc Gordon from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, in short, UNDRR. It will be an hour-long session today. At the beginning, Marc will give a presentation, and later I will take questions from you. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. Here, you will see it in the bottom right corner. Before we start, I want to take the opportunity to introduce Marc briefly. Of course, he has over 23 years of professional experience in the field of disaster risk reduction. In brief, at present, he works at the UNDRR, where he heads the Global Risk Analysis and Reporting Unit. He is also the coordinator and lead author of the Global Assessment Report. Previously, he headed the Sendai Framework Monitoring Unit and coordinated the Hugo Framework for Action. He has extensive and relevant fieldwork experience working in many countries, few to mention in Cambodia, Congo, Guinea, Indonesia, Myanmar, Philippines, Sri Lanka, East Timor, and in Vietnam. Today, Marc will deliver the keynote speech on the systematic nature of risk and the COVID-19 pandemic. I welcome Marc on behalf of UCL IRDR. Marc, now the platform is yours. Thank you. Marc, you can.
Thank you, Bayes. Okay, now I'm able to unmute. Thank you very much indeed, Bayes, and my apologies, colleagues, for having kept you waiting. No sooner as I gone online than one of my workstations just died, so I had to switch computers. Thank you for your patience. I will talk today and I will share a few slides to take us through. So I hope that you are now able to see the slide on the screen. Please let me know if you cannot.
Yes, we can.
Very good. Thank you, Bayes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have been invited to join you today and would like to thank the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, its director, Professor Peter Sammons, and of course you, Dr. Bayes Ahmed, for having coordinated the event and assured the transition online. No easy task, as we have discovered. I'm delighted to be able to join such an illustrious gathering of minds and experience at a moment in the contemplation of humans' relationships with and place in nature and society that really truly feels pivotal. Yes, a time of great uncertainty, but also of opportunity, with the abstract becoming tangible, palpable, and for so many, all too real. Now is a time for heightened global emergency. The need for ambitious collective action to better understand the systemic nature of risk, to build resilience and achieve sustainable regenerative development has never been greater. The impacts of COVID-19 the world over, of both the disease and the measures taken to mitigate its consequences, are of course yet to be fully understood. But the realities we now navigate exist because a series of decisions about ways to reduce risk were not followed. The COVID-19 pandemic is not a black swan event. As many of you will recognize, some countries had conducted simulations that were perhaps encouragingly close to what has transpired. And yet, despite this, the measures recommended were not adopted. We cannot say we did not know. Inaction prevailed. And to quote Gilbert White, why is it then, in spite of knowing more, we are not doing better? The Sendai framework sought to help. Member states recognized that dealing with 21st century risks was impossible if approaches favoring event-based hazard by hazard ex-post response and recovery predominated at the expense of ex-ante prevention and mitigation. Approaches that recognize the pluralistic, multidimensional nature of risk, encapsulated in the broadening of scope from one of natural hazards to human-induced hazards and risks. It signaled the transition from managing disasters to managing risk and provoked a dramatic shift in how we think about and use risk assessment. It seeks to provoke deep reflection on how we organize, interact, and collaborate, to push us to re-examine and redesign the constructs that define how we conduct research, educate, develop knowledge, make decisions, and invest, and shape or be shaped by capital in a fashion that is not beholden to perhaps post-Enlightenment reductionism removed from context. Indeed, to reinforce the very nature of individual and collective responsibility through the choices we make, the lifestyles we live. And in so doing, the Sendai framework reinforced the centrality of understanding and managing risk to all of the 2015 agendas and beyond. That a risk-based discourse could be the connecting tissue for all of these frameworks, agreements, and agendas, if indeed regenerative sustainable development is to be achieved. The Sendai framework emphasized that risk is systemic, and so it proved prescient. Anticipating the realization of systemic risks with local to global to local cascading consequences and feedback loops that reverberate across communities, sectors, geographies, and scales. This particular diagram coming, as many of those you will see from the Global Assessment Report 2019, and this particular one being a representation of the multiple breadbasket failure, which was a scenario or hypothesis developed by Yasso in the context of global food price spikes and particularly bread price spikes and the Jasmine Revolution. The global pandemic emergency COVID-19, however, has made very real the nature of realized systemic risks, revealing as it does the precarious nature of the systems upon which trade, food, energy, transportation, social safety nets, and many others depend. It is a disaster, a catastrophe even, that is impacting the social and economic environment, the physical environment and lifestyles, the very same systems that created the conditions for this virus to emerge, propagate, and transform from a localized outbreak into a global pandemic catastrophe. And as you will all, I'm sure, acutely recognize, we are fast approaching the point where we may not be able to mitigate or repair impacts from realized cascading and systemic risks, particularly those due to climate and ecological change. And we hope that the COVID-19 pandemic will provide the defibrillator that will jolt us all out of our torpor. This impels us to improve our understanding of the interdependencies between system components and improve our understanding and management of the systemic nature of risk. Ultimately, the choices made now in respect of risk and resilience to favor human and ecosystems' health and well-being in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, instead of economic models that favor optimization and efficiency, driven by the myth of eternal growth, dependent upon the notion of an inexhaustible bounty of nature, will determine our ability to manage risks that will dwarf the pandemic and eliminate any hope of achieving the goals and aspirations of the 2030 Agenda and beyond. Of course, a return to normal is therefore a return to those same mutually reinforcing conditions that gave rise to the pandemic in the first place. Resuming business as usual, rebuilding the same systems, will generate more risks, yielding similar outcomes. Framed correctly, however, and perhaps following what I call the innovation curve here, the actions that governments and other stakeholders choose can transform the sectors that they seek to save. The urgency is evident, and the opportunity is there. We have observed governments resting back and wielding power in a fashion the likes of which many countries have not seen in decades. Not without its own risks, but fomenting change, dare I say, transformation, despite facets of transience, that has been demonstrated to be possible. It demands of all of us much greater ambition and action that is proportionate to the scale of the threat. Not what is convenient, but what is necessary. As we have been reminded by many, and not least Greta Thunberg, and even more recently by the threat posed by COVID-19, there are no grey areas when it comes to survival, she said. Now we all have a choice. We can create transformational action that will safeguard the future living conditions for humankind and all other species, or we can continue with business as usual and fail. That is up to you and me. And of course, notwithstanding those who do not have the choices that we have, it is our choices that matter. And this is at the heart of the exploration of ideas and questions that we put forward in GAR19. And indeed, we seek to try and navigate our way through in the reality of the COVID world. As mentioned, the Sendai framework emphasizes that risk is systemic and that it is everyone's business. Never has this been more visible, more tangibly real for more people than it is right now in the midst of the pandemic. Much of what has come and we'll discuss today is laid out in Chapter 2 of the Global Assessment Report 2019. This chapter was not intended to be a conclusive set of answers or solutions, but rather as a preliminary exploration, a means of connecting with you and many other communities and constituencies, sought to expose the challenges and questions that we are faced with in better understanding the systemic nature of risks and the possibilities afforded by new approaches and new concepts of risks. This, we argued, will be the central challenge of the first half of the 21st century. The chapter builds from a fundamental exploration of why the systemic nature of risk matters and why we need a new view to understand the systemic this nature, and the development ultimately of a three-dimensional topographic map of risk through time. It continues by articulating the importance of understanding the difference between complicated and complex systems and the fundamental characteristics of systemic risks. It takes us through a preliminary exploration of whether systemic risk can ever be effectively governed. We must anticipate, of course, and allow room to deal with surprise and non-linear change with flexibility and nimbleness in our strategies and plans. We must seek to be able to make real-time adjustments that anticipate and respond to change when pursuing economic activity and sustainable development. And this, of course, requires adaptive anticipatory planning frameworks that seek to identify the drivers of risk across systems to prevent and mitigate risk, and that allow implementers to react quickly. But our flexibility must be as dynamic as the change we hope to survive. We must act with urgency and with much greater ambition, proportional to the scale of the threat. But this is one of the fundamental questions and challenges that we are confronted with. How do we move our current governance architecture towards allowing nimble and agile flexibility, adaptive organization to foment the systems innovations that are required to deal with systemic risks? A question that has been scrutinized acutely in the COVID reality. In GAR19, we also explored the importance of building collective intelligence and new ways to generate relational information and warm data to better understand the dynamic nature of complex, adaptive living systems. Moving beyond antiquated notions of control that one could argue are rooted in Western Enlightenment era thinking about the dominion of man over nature, of the ability to control the behavior of complex living systems through the elimination of context and the objectification through a reductionist approach to quantify, monetize, towards a transdisciplinary environment in which we restore the notion of context and examine the relational information between knowledge nodes. And ultimately to release ourselves into the liminal space of uncertainty, ambiguity, and multiplicity. All of which so as to expand the data ecosystem, to map the true topography of risk, to develop broader decision compasses, and to incentivize risk reduction to mobilize people, innovation, and finance at the epic scale and with the urgency that has now been made much more visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Chapter 2 of GAR 2019 were 10 recommendations. These are perhaps even more compelling as potential considerations for national and subnational governments, private sector businesses and investors, and communities and citizens across the world, as we are all forced to explore the limitations of current systems and current ways of understanding, and examine different pathways into the future as we learn to live with COVID-19. These 10 recommendations are as follows. 1, accelerated action and ambition to transition from managing disasters to managing risks, from managing conventional hazards to engineering and improved understanding of the dynamic interactions with systemic risks. 2, changing deeply embedded values that define higher level rules of operation and interaction to avoid the continuation of the creation of wealth at the expense of declining ecological life support functions in positive spiraling feedback loops that create systemic risks with cascading effects, and make overarching economic, ecological, and social systems increasingly susceptible to collapse. 3, major renovations of approaches to risk assessment and analysis, shift from the current focus on the largest and most historically obvious and tractable risks to the full topography of risks. 4, use of scenario building and stochastic simulations to facilitate thinking and decision-making in complex systems contexts. 5, activating the power of human, social, and contextual intelligence, and where possible, combining it with appropriately designed artificial intelligence. 6, developing the capability for transcontextual understanding and decision-making by generating relational information as a more effective way of understanding and living with uncertainty and complexity than the present reliance on extrinsic frames of reference and categorical expertise, siloed into disciplines. 7, focusing on place-based solutions and collaborative development of contextual relational information based on self-organizing around actions co-created with local ownership of data, risks, and solutions through mutual learning and building collective intelligence. 8, improving understanding of the interactions and interdependencies between urban and rural areas by developing a functioning urban, rural, or city region data metabolism to process information at appropriate scales to understand the system's implications and the systemic nature of risk therein. 9, accelerating action by private sector financial institutions to integrate risk information into their core business models and practices, and indeed, ultimately into all financial transactions, and rapidly shift to 100% risk-informed investments, wherein risk is also more accurately priced. 10, developing and encouraging new structures and approaches to bringing forward information and informing decision-making approaches that present the contextual interdependencies of potential systemic risk impacts as they are felt at the individual microscopic level with larger global macroscopic contexts. These recommendations were inspired by, yes, the Sendai framework, and indeed by an increasingly growing community of collaborators seeking to grapple with these 21st century challenges. The Sendai framework, in increasing the scope to include natural and human-induced hazards and risks, it was countries themselves that recognized the imperative of systemic approaches to managing the systemic nature of risk, and thereby provided the basis for the connecting tissue for all of the main global policy agendas, whether the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development or the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda or the Biodiversity Convention, and so many more. So with that, I look forward to hearing and learning from you all as we continue on this learning journey that necessarily must allow us to more effectively grapple with complexity and ultimately live more comfortably with uncertainty, as we redefine our assumptions of and our relationship with the natural world from one of humans and nature to humans in nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc, for your very insightful and inspiring presentation. And thanks for recommending the 10 bullet points. That's quite helpful for us on how to manage risk. We have a couple of questions from the audience and also from our side. We have done some small research on UNDRR and you. I will start with taking a few questions from the audience. It's typed here already. Let me read it out. How would the UN help the refugees who are currently struggling with inadequate supplies and poor housing that helps spread the virus further? I mean, Marc, do you want to comment on it?
Well, thank you, anonymous attendee, for that question. I feel rather ill-equipped to be able to answer your question. If you are unfamiliar with the nature of the UNDRR, we are not an entity that necessarily has a mandate, nor indeed do we have the competences and capabilities to operate in the context which you are referring to. This is a concern, clearly, for those trying to support an integrated risk reduction approach within the immediate emergency management phase, the immediate responses to the pandemic outbreak, and obviously in limiting transition and further rises in caseload. This is not an issue that is restricted simply to informal settlements or refugee environments or even internally displaced environments. But these are aspects that are being very seriously addressed by sister agencies such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and others that recognize that the measures that have been possible to be imposed in contexts such as we have seen in many Western European and other industrialized countries are simply not applicable. What I have observed in terms of advice coming out of the World Health Organization, including the special envoys on COVID-19, is to recognize the realities in which many exist, to determine measures, whether from personal hygiene, from social interaction, from livelihood generation, that to the degree possible can mitigate further spread, further transmission. And that has generated some extremely innovative notions of waterless hand washing, of support, collaboration between communities in a hygienic fashion for collective effort in generating sufficient resources for households to survive this particular phase. But I'm afraid I'm not necessarily a competent body to be, or authority to be able to answer your question to the degree of your satisfaction.
Okay, thank you, Marc. And probably we have now more relevant questions for you and UNDRR. So the next question is, what is the role of UNDRR in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic? Are you specifically working with any organization, such as the World Health Organization, or with any specific governments? Could you please bring any practical examples?
So yes, the UNDRR is working with a great deal of different governments and organizations in the COVID phase, throughout all of the regions of the world. I think evidently one of the areas that we would be keen to try and foment, but it depends a little bit on the appetite and the capability and absorption capacity of those governments to be able to accommodate this thought, is already within the response phase that many governments are initiating in the context of COVID, to start examining some of the broader underlying risk drivers that have contributed to the genesis of the virus, the conversion of a localized outbreak into a global pandemic, and what can be done on an individual country and indeed in international collaborative basis to prevent or mitigate this from having similar consequences in the long run. That is a challenge, where, as many will recognize, with so many of public services and particularly health systems stretched, even at breaking point, the capacity and capability to be able to incorporate this at this moment in time is extremely limited. But as countries are coming through the immediate emergency response phase, looking to insert this kind of thinking, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, into the stimulus packages that are being offered and are being rolled out in multiple contexts, is an absolute imperative if we are not wishing to rebuild the same systems that have contributed to the conditions that gave rise to this in the first place, whether these are from consumption patterns that are driving high-risk production practices, wildland encroachment and increasing interaction between humans and natural systems, unregulated food chains, all the way through to a hyper-connected trade and transport network that enabled such a rapid acceleration in the spread of the virus worldwide. These are all elements that the UNDRR is going to be looking at in the medium to long term. But in the short term, there have been extremely intensive efforts to try and assist countries and organizations assisting countries to understand from a risk reduction point of view how the immediate impact of the virus in first and potentially second wave infections can be mitigated, particularly for the most vulnerable. And this has involved interaction with every organizations as wide and varied as the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, to the regional economic commissions, and many others. And this continues to be an area of investigation and inquiry and support from the UNDRR as we move forward.
Thank you, Marc, again. And we have today around 170 participants here, and you can guess we are getting lots of questions. I will try to address as many as possible. We have around 20 minutes. So to Marc, the next question is from Claudia. Very relevant, I believe. How well do you think the UN is doing to achieve the risk-informed sustainable development? And the next is, of course, it's about your recommendations. You have the 10 recommendations. You have mentioned today? And do you see your recommendations being accepted by the UN member states and also the non-member states? That is very important. The non-member states. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Claudia, for your questions. Yes, I wouldn't like to be the teacher that's giving the scorecard to the UN system in terms of really creating and driving risk-informed sustainable development. It's not that it is not being attempted. I just feel that certainly pre-COVID, the notion of fundamentally challenging some of the constructs to which I referred earlier, in terms of how we learn, how we research, how we transform insights into knowledge and support to decision making in public and private spheres, has tended to take an incremental approach to tweaks on existing systems, whereas what has been coming through so very clearly in COVID, and indeed has been highlighted for many decades in the context of, for example, climate change, is that fundamental transformations are required. And I think that's probably what you're alluding to in your question is, do I think that we are moving in the right direction in terms of those transitions and transformations? The answer is no. And the imperative to do so now is so very acutely visible in the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is what I mean as how we must do all we can to highlight the opportunity that this provides for some of these transformative elements being incorporated into the way we think, we research, we decide, we invest, how we choose to live our lives. And that I would have said pre-COVID was looking pretty far off. It still is. And it may be that what we see, and I fear, and you will detect in my response here that I don't pretend to have answers. I'm here as much as you as part of this learning journey. I fear that the very fundamental changes that were able to be installed in many societies in response to COVID, not all, but those that were able to make such decisions and had the buffers that enabled people to weather lockdown, were serious changes and demonstrated that we as a species are capable of dramatic change if the conditions lend themselves to that. My concern is that that may have been accepted, at least in industrialized countries, simply because it was considered and perceived to be temporary, and that there would be a return to business as usual. I would say that there has been a greater awareness of the role of the individual and the collective in creating the conditions for such risks to manifest that actually do affect them as individuals, and that may lend itself to a stronger drive for individuals calling governments to account and holding institutions and organizations responsible for taking on board a more, or recognizing the pluralistic nature of what we're dealing with, moving from the siloed, sectorized, departmentalized, and projectized approaches that have prevailed in most public and private investment towards the kind of collaborative arrangements building on a broader collective intelligence that enables transdisciplinary interaction to start to address some of these key issues. And I do start to see that emerging quite strongly in some parts of the UN system, and that is encouraging. Is it something that UN member states and non-member states are ready to accept? Increasingly so, but of course this is still embryonic. And I would I am encouraged, however, to see that this is being taken up by a number of different governments in different contexts. There's some interesting examples in Vietnam, for example, around plastic pollution. There's some interesting examples in Indonesia around palm oil production and green commodities. And these are by no means the unique cases. So one area, and I think your final parenthesis there around non-member states, I guess will allude to, is around private investment and the role of business in defining the riskscape, and perhaps one should extrapolate to that of the broader financial system and investor community as to how capital fundamentally shapes much of the riskscape around us. Again, elements of what we speak, to which we speak here, are being considered and an increasingly robust discussion. Is the system changing fast enough? No. But we will continue to advocate for a more effective pricing of risk within all financial transactions, from the current state that is, well, in my view, criminally underpriced, to one that fundamentally calls upon us all to re-examine how we attribute value, and that both in the financial context, but equally in the societal context of moving away from valuing material wealth to attributing value to more human aspects that one would hope will help us reconfigure how we judge and make choices moving forward and call our institutions to account.
Thank you again, Marc. And we're getting lots of questions. We have 15 minutes. I will try to merge some of the questions and ask you all together, the thematic one. So yes, you mentioned several times private investment. That is really very interesting. But we have some relevant questions from our audience, from Lena and Rory. They mentioned, do you think private companies will actually change their exploitation nature? I mean, the exploitation of nature and human labor, especially women. And also Rory asked about, there is rising number of nationalism, and there is a trend of rejecting the experts and also small scale investment on nations. I mean, these are the different difficulties we're facing at the moment. The private companies, they're exploiting nature, human labor, nationalism, and self-centric or country-specific thinking and thought process. Do you think it will impact the overall achievement from UNDRR?
Okay, thanks, Bias. Each time I try and unmute, you have to give me the permission to unmute. So, yeah, a good question, Lena, and I would never claim to have a definitive answer. I guess the simple and probably dissatisfying response, I'm afraid, is to say not without a strong demand signal, and that can only come from consumers, and that is why, for me, the manner in which individuals have been so directly connected to the consequences of a realized risk such as COVID, that in many instances will seem so very distant from their day-to-day decision making, is so very important, and something that I hope that we can really play upon in terms of really starting to inculcate that notion of a more direct relationship between behavior, decisions, lifestyle choices, and the consequences which are systemic of those decisions. So this will be a line of inquiry that I'm very keen to explore in the context of the next GAR. how we can start to translate the appreciation of the notion of individual and collective accountability and responsibility in the determination of the risk-scape, and how that relates to both the commercial interpretation of that behavior and those demand signals, as well as the call for our public institutions to be able to support an enabling environment in which these demand signals, which we hope will evolve in recognizing the deleterious potential consequences of unchecked consumption and this addiction to the myth of eternal growth, will be checked. That isn't an easy ask, particularly in countries which are seeking to develop themselves out of or into scenarios of more prosperity. But the one element in terms of, and you leveled this equally at private companies. My area I've been more interested in the financial sector and looking at how we can start to, in what ways can we harness the capabilities and the power of financial institutions here, from everything from insurers and reinsurers through to banks, through to stock exchanges and securities commissions. How do we harness the power of self-interest that drives this machinery that is essentially sociopathic, to be able to recognize an inherent return on investment, which is ultimately the principal driver for their behavior, that is recognizant of human and ecosystems health and well-being, because that makes sense in the long run. The challenge, of course, in particularly within the financial system, is what the former governor of the Bank of England called the tragedy of the horizon, that as a function of quarterly shareholder dividends, as a function of 12-month insurance contracts, the incentives to invest differently over a different temporal scale that would be easier to more evidently demonstrate return on investment are against that. And one could argue that the same applies to the 4-year political cycle. And that also questions our very governance constructs. But equally, this notion of the decisions that are taken by private and public institutions and entities being done so in isolation of each other as a function of this, the manner in which societies have evolved to deal with complexity by identifying specific domains, disciplines, sectors, etc., and developing expertise and mastery in each, but then never the twain shall meet, they don't speak to each other. This is something that I do see starting to shift. It will need to shift with a significant change in incentive structures, including in the research and education and scientific community. And there are interesting and very live discussions going on in the research funding environment as to how do we foment an environment in which the reward culture for academia, for example, is not driven on specific discipline and domain, but fundamentally promotes transdisciplinarity, because that is what 21st century decision makers that are starting to emerge, that do think through systems lenses, are going to need in terms of information support. I digressed a little bit, I hope you forgive me.
Yes, thank you, Marc. And 2 last questions, sorry to the audience. We have around 19 questions. It's difficult, we have time limit. Marc, you mentioned it is quite impossible to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals without implementing the Sendai framework and understanding risk. But let's talk about the practicality of it. I mean, one audience asked a question. We have a number of national and international policies and tools on DRR. However, challenges remain how to translate them at local level, and there's a huge gap in implementation. So with all these different policy guidelines and documents and tools on DRR, but still you can see the COVID-19 has unleashed it. Like we all are facing globally, from Latin America to us, Australia, we are facing, despite having all these different documentations and regulations, why we're failing, and why we're failing to translate it at local level. Where's the gap of implementation?
I can see you're all enjoying torturing me with these questions. It's I don't pretend to have the answers. What I am seeing as being as emerging as part of the certainly the shifts within some of the multilateral system and within some governments, this movement away from projectized approaches to what one could call portfolio approaches, which really starts to grapple with the identification of problems and the experimentation of solutions, I would say, rather than provision, because that's certainly something I would think we would need to shift our own mindset towards, is in part a function of the process that underpins some of these experimental journeys. And that is a much more significant dialogic process that is significantly more inclusive of different constituencies and stakeholders than perhaps has been the case in the past. That has been challenged, of course, by the nature of our financing architecture and financing mechanisms, and the particularly within the sustainable development sphere, where finance being provided has increasingly been required to demonstrate value for money return on investment that is measurable in terms of results and deliverables. One might call it the curse of the log frame culture. In many instances where I'm starting to see some of these more innovative approaches emerging, it is it sounds a bit trite, but it is as much the process that's as important as the mechanism, as the outputs and the deliverables that are defined at the onset. In many instances, these will be determined by doing. And I've just actually yesterday participated in an exercise where UNDP is going through some very significant reflections on fundamentally how it is going to organize itself moving forward in supporting governments to undertake these types of approaches, which you may have heard referred to as sense making, or of systems transformations processes that are seeking to bring in a much more inclusive and diverse spectrum of actors in trying to translate that which Bayesi referred to as enshrined within policy and plans and make it applicable in the local level. And I would go back once again to this notion of context, which certainly within a traditional risk assessment community, the robustness that has tended to be accorded and the faith that has been accorded to many risk modeled outcomes, for example, of course, many of you will recognize are fundamentally based on a whole series of assumptions that allow a defensible methodology and output, but fundamentally, in removing it from context, oversimplify to the point that whilst it may be representative of a for example, single hazard angle, is far from the reality of a systemic risk environment. And this notion, I use that as an example of just re-establishing this notion of context and understanding that there is much more knowledge to be drawn from than perhaps traditional approaches have tended to rely upon.
Okay, thank you, Mark. One last quick question, and then we will close the session today. So you have extensive working experience. You have worked in developing countries and also in developed countries, working for UNDRR for over 13 years. So do you see any hope in the future based on all the discussions? You have lots of problems, of course, facing natural hazards, pandemics, and conflicts all together. And yes, if you see any light ahead of us, or what would be the future challenges to tackle this kind of multi-hazard context?
Yes, it is something that is not necessarily evident within the current context, and many of these really acute questions that we've seen coming in through the chat and the Q&A, which I'm sorry, I would love to be able to spend an entire day discussing these with you, not providing answers. The environment that seems to be a disintegrating multilateral sphere to an increasingly inward-looking nationalistic environment, in part, is a function of many of the things that we've talked about in this last hour or so. But what I have observed, and albeit it is most definitely the exception rather than the rule, is where we have the possibility to provide people a how do I want to put it, a safe space in which to truly express themselves without fear of recrimination, to express uncertainty, to express confusion, as part of this shift in terms of how we value things, what is important to us. At the risk of sounding utopian and idealistic, I think it's about fundamentally valuing those things that actually we all value, but perhaps have deprioritized, around love, around care, around consideration for others. And when those environments, when we have conversations of this nature, whether in terms of trying to better understand context and drawing from multiple sources of information, or exploring how can we be more intelligent in implying perhaps what we instinctively know better in our decision making in a more collective, collaborative fashion. This has started to emerge, albeit in a few in the contexts, as a source of optimism for me. Is it going to be enough within the timeframes that we are potentially facing with the climate breakdown, as the clathrates melt and the permafrost thaws and the Arctic ice sheet disappears? Maybe not, but it does seem to me, in an environment that the bias I suspect you're presenting is hopeless, to give me some cause for hope.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Again, I picked two words, collective and collaborative. That's really important. We all work together from local to global scale to address the ongoing pandemic and the future disasters to tackle.
And if I may, Bias, I would add to that humility and care. And if we can inculcate much of what we do, and I try to live that myself by never pretending to be the provider of answers, but simply a provoker of deep reflection that can help, I hope, us explore new pathways that can give us optimism for the future.
Yes, the four things: collective, collaborative, humanity, and care, and new pathways to address the upcoming problems. Thank you, Marc, for your time and your powerful presentation, and thanks for trying to address the different comments. Yes, you can understand we have around 150 participants with different backgrounds, they had different questions, and that was really a useful event for us. We came to know a lot from you and from your organization, and hopefully we will move forward with all the recommendations, the 10 recommendations you have mentioned today. We'll try to integrate in policy and in practical implementation. I want to thank Marc again, and thank you, the participants. Sharp at 2 p.m., we will come back again in this platform. We are now going for lunch break. I will stop live streaming, and then at 2 p.m., after 1 hour, we'll be welcoming the Right Honorable Hilary Benn MP, and he will be interviewed by Chris, an award winner journalist. So see you all in an hour in this platform, the public Zoom link. And you can now return here. You can join the breakout sessions if you have time. And thank you, everyone. And thank you, Marc.
My pleasure, and thank you, Bayez, for having organized this session. It's been wonderful to interact with you, and I hope that we can continue the conversation. There were a great deal insightful and pertinent and difficult questions that will only be answered if we will only be answered together. So thank you, and wishing you well for the rest of the conference.
Thank you.